Welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar sponsored by LRQA, a leading global assurance provider supporting clients on their journey to a safer, more secure, and more sustainable future. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team at E&E Leader, I welcome you to using ISO management systems to reach ESG goals. This event will be a collaborative effort between our speaker and audience members. During the presentation, Heather Moore, Supply Chain Technical Director for Director for Sustainability, at LRQA, will dive into the key drivers of sustainability as well as reporting frameworks. We do have a total of 6 poll questions during today's event. The poll questions will record data during the live broadcast as well as on demand. Questions specific to the presentation as well as any technical questions may be submitted through the Q&A chat widget, which is already open on your screen. We just ask that before submitting technical questions that you follow the help widget steps at the bottom of your console. Please feel free to utilize the attendee chat feature. You may have to double click twice on it for it to open. Say hello, let us know where you're from. Feel free to interact with other attendees on today. I will tell you that we have over 75 countries represented from our registrants. So it is fantastic to see such a global audience on with us. Additionally, take note of the 2 call to action buttons and resources provided by E&E Leader as well as LRQA, and feel free to connect with attendees as well as us on our social channels. Just a quick reminder, if for some reason your slide does not advance during the poll questions, refresh your page and you should be good to go. And I do apologize at any point today if 1 or 3 of my dogs start barking. Hopefully we get through this event without any extra noise. But enough for me. You are here to listen to Heather. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Heather. We really enjoy all the insight that you bring to our audience. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you and rejoin you at the end of your presentation for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. I'm excited to speak with everyone on the call today, and let's just get started. I have about 20 minutes of, maybe 15, 20 minutes of talking, and then we'll open for questions after that. So as an auditor, one of my favorite things is bringing individuals together through the audit process within an organization who have never worked together before, right? Sometimes it's procurement and environmental staff, or real estate division and environmental staff. The concepts here and this talk is about bringing 2 systems and 2 tools together that match quite well. And I don't really see how you can have one without the other. And hopefully you'll agree with me at the end of this. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to sustainability, what it is. I think we all have a fairly good idea about what that is, what the drivers are, and 4 of the most common reporting frameworks that companies use to be transparent about their sustainability efforts and climate risk. We'll talk through that. We'll look at what the commonalities are between those frameworks, and then we'll go on to looking at ISO management systems and what those are. I'll give you an introduction just so we all have the same understanding. And then the third part will be how they fit together quite well. Excellent. So let me move this forward. Yeah. So obviously, impacts of climate change are being felt around the world. These visible impacts are forcing people's attention and calling on corporations to act. That's why we're here talking about this, right? Now more than ever, it is really critical for companies to consider their impact on climate change and associated mitigation and adaptation efforts, and looking at their strategies and operations and how they're disclosing and evaluating their climate risk. I see 3 reasons for this, right? One is, my background is in environmental engineering. I've been in auditing for about 15 years, focused on environmental. And within the past maybe 3-4 years, finally there's this huge uptick in sustainability. And I see it, that the financial sector has joined in with the environmentalists, and they see the light here, right? The financial sector investors are saying climate risk is actually something that we need to be considering. You know, Larry Fink of BlackRock has been talking about sustainability for a number of years, and they realize that it's something they want to understand how the companies they're investing in are dealing with it. And also consumers are smarter. We want to make sure the brands that we're purchasing are credible, and we want to trust what we're doing and trust that what they're doing is correct. And I think because of those two things, there's also a growing regulatory demand for companies to talk about their climate risk and talk about how they're handling it. So, different ways to do it, right? There's tons of standards out there that are trying to help companies report on ESG or sustainability. And I've brought up the 4 most common, and I call these reporting frameworks because they help companies understand how best to frame all of the information and data that they're gathering and make it easier for us to understand and compare against company versus company. So there's 2 on the left, Global Reporting Initiative and CDP. They're 2 different, but they're very all-inclusive. They ask a lot of questions. If you look at those reports that companies prepare in line with those frameworks, they tell you a lot of information about what the company is doing, what their strategy is, how they're mitigating their risk, and also the data. On the right side, you'll see 2 that are more focused on what investors want to know, SASB standards that are now part of IFRS, and also TCFD. And what I've done in this slide is try to pull out the most important things that each of those frameworks are asking companies to report. And I wanted to see what's common, right? So here you can see there's governance, right? Everyone wants to know how companies are governing their climate risk. Obviously, strategy and risk assessment is also part of it. But then the pink words here are all data, right? So you'll see economic performance, environmental performance for GRI is really emissions data, energy data reported to CDP. And then in the SASB and TCFD, there's metrics that they want to see, right? You want to see progress and how the companies are demonstrating progress. So really from these, there's governance, strategy, risk, and metrics, those 4 things. So just remember those 4 things and we'll come back to them at the end. So, oops. All right, so now we have the first 3 poll questions, and I'm interested to know what standards do you report against? So it could be all of the above, it could be one or the other. I'll give you a few minutes, not a few minutes, maybe a few seconds to answer this question. SASB, these are just the 4 that we just talked about. And then industry specific, there's others that you might be reporting against. So let's move on past this. Let's see. So looks like a lot of companies on the webinar are using CDP and GRI. Smaller percentages are using the investor-led SASB and TCFD, which those are newer, so that makes sense to me. And yes, there are tons of industry-specific as well. Excellent. Well, thank you for answering that one. Let's go on. So that's how you're reporting your data. Now let's go on, and I'm interested to know who is responsible for your sustainability reporting. Right? You have one person, you have a sustainability manager or sustainability director who reports that. Is it a team? Maybe it's not just one person. Hopefully they have a team of people supporting them. Or maybe maybe you don't have a sustainability leader. Maybe it's a risk or a legal counsel or other. So I'll give you a little bit longer to answer this question, and then we'll move on to see the answer. All right, moving on. So it looks like most have, 44% have a corporate sustainability team, which is excellent. because you definitely need a team to do this work. It's a lot for one person. But I can see the majority is really on the sustainability side of things, sustainability roles within a company. Thank you for answering that. Now we have one more. So what is your, in thinking about reporting and everything you're doing, what is your biggest worry about your organization's sustainability objectives? First one, we don't have one. Maybe you don't have an objective. You don't know where to start. Ability to measure it. How are you measuring your objectives? Who's accountable for it? You overstate how well you're doing. That happens. Or maybe you have other worries. I think perhaps a combination of all of these is what most companies are worrying about. I see the percent of attendees answering this question is still going up, so I'll give you a few, maybe a few more seconds to reply. We have 45% who have answered it already, which is excellent. 48%. It's still going up, so let's just wait. This is one that I'm very interested in, so I want to see if we can get the most responses here. All right, well, we are over half of the attendees, 57%, so I'm just going to move on and see the results. So yeah, so 45% say the ability to measure your sustainability objectives is your biggest worry. I understand that, and I think hopefully we'll give you some answers to that in the rest of this webinar. Thank you for all who responded. I appreciate it. Moving on to sustainability scorecard, right? How do you measure it? What are you measuring? And really the point here, so this circle here is our kind of assurance cycle. But what I want to highlight from this is that at the middle of the circle is data. And data, right? There's standards that help us understand how to use the data. You can monitor, verify the data. You can use it to set actionable improvements, things like that. But really the main driver of this whole thing is data. And so where is your data coming from? For most organizations, your data is coming from your sites. If it's a manufacturing organization, you have manufacturing plants around, they're using energy, using water, creating waste. You know, this is the data that we're talking about. And it's similar for other organizations and other industries as well. So looking at a site level, that is what brings us to ISO management system standards. Now, if you're not familiar with management systems are really the way in which an organization manages the interrelated parts of its business to achieve its objectives, right? And objectives can relate to a number of things. It could be product quality, quality of the service you're providing, environmental performance. Obviously, I've given some examples of management system standards here. 14,001 is for environmental management systems, 50,001 is energy, 46 is water, and 45 is health and safety. So whatever your objective is, your management system is how you group your business together and make it work to meet these objectives, right? I would say that ISO management systems help organizations improve their performance by using two different things, right? One is it specifies repeatable steps that an organization can implement to achieve these objectives, right? So repeatable steps. And then the second is it creates a culture of engagement. There's a cycle of self-evaluation, correction, improvement of operations, and employee awareness. And so it's engaging the full organization to make this happen. Right? So repeatable steps that you can follow and really fully a culture of engagement. And those are the two things that I see that are very important that the ISO standards help you with. These standards were developed by international experts with expertise in global management, leadership strategies, effective and efficient processes and practices. Most importantly, I feel these standards, no matter what you're looking at, whether it be environmental, energy, water, whatever, quality, they have common clauses or sections within the standard that enable each of these standards to fit perfectly together. So here's, if you're familiar with management systems, you have seen this many times. This is the plan, do, check, act cycle. And it fits in all of the different clauses in any standard that you pick up. You'll see clause 4, which is the context of the organization. That's where you start. That helps you understand your organization, the issues that can affect it, and your ability to achieve your intended results. Right? In the center is clause 5, which is leadership, which leadership is required to do to visibly support the system and show that the system is not separate from the way business is done. Then there's clause 6, which is planning, and that's where you identify any risks and opportunities. You look at the objectives, what you want to achieve, and how you are going to plan to achieve them. Right? And then you have clause 7 and 8, which 7 is all about support. Do you have the sufficient support to achieve your objectives, like resources, competence, communication, things like that. Clause 8 is operations. Make sure you have the right controls in place within your operations to achieve these objectives. It could be you need to write work instructions to operate equipment safely, or you need to have meters installed to correctly measure your water use, or whatever that might be, right? So that's clause 8. And then clause 9 is covering, you've collected the data, you've analyzed it, now how are you doing? These are results, and how are you analyzing your results? But it also includes not just results of your data that you're collecting, your water use, for example, but it also looks at how the system is performing itself. So you have internal audits and management reviews to make sure that the system is working as it should be. And then finally, there's clause 10, which mandates the continual improvement process. So that's just a brief overview of every clause. If you pick up any of these ISO management system standards, they'll all have these similar overarching clauses, and perhaps the details within each one will change based on what you're looking at. But these are the drivers of these standards. So what are the benefits of using this process, right? It sets up a common language within an organization. Common scope. Everyone at site 1 and site 2 and site 3, they're all using the same language. They're all calling hazardous waste the same thing, and they know what they mean. For example, there's a common audit trail. There's common items that you have to document. You know where you're keeping them. Internal audits are set. And internal audits is really a good way to share information around the sites and make sure you're all doing things the best way that you can. Leadership is involved. Obviously, there's a commitment and visibility of the leadership. You have third-party oversight, and obviously all these things push continual improvement. So now let's pause here, and I have the three remaining poll questions around your ISO standards. So what ISO standards does your company have that gives you the most support to your sustainability strategy? So I'll give you some time to think. I see the responses are coming in slowly. And you can think about how they relate, right? Your sustainability strategy, you might have goals around energy use. Does that fall into 14,001 environmental? Does it fall into energy 50,001? Maybe you have some goals around social goals, right, around health and safety. So that obviously would be 45,001. We have over half have responded, so that's excellent. I'll wait maybe 5 more seconds, and then we'll see the results. All right. Moving on. Yeah. So 14,001, I would say, is probably the most common. 60% of you responded that actually using 14,001, that management system, does support your sustainability strategy, which is excellent. All right, now let's move on to the next poll question. So these other poll questions are looking at how you maintain your systems. So who is responsible? Do you have a site level quality EHS person? Do you have maybe a corporate function who's over all the sites, who's managing your certified system? Or is it another role, risk management, or sustainability governance? I think you get extra points if you say sustainability. One thing that I've seen in a lot of companies is EHS has been around for a while, and that structure is set, and sustainability has been added to the top at the corporate level, but they're not quite linked together. And so in some organizations it has, right? Some, the more mature, they have linked their sustainability and EHS. Sometimes now they call it EHSS, which is environmental health, safety, and sustainability. So that, that's progress, but it definitely is, you see how your systems can help support your goals around sustainability. All right, we're almost to the halfway mark. We have 49%. If we can get a couple more in there, then we'll get a good smattering of who's responsible. Right, so 50%, I think that's good. Let's just move on. Okay, yeah, so that's what I anticipated, right? So it's corporate, 50% have a corporate team, another 36% have site level EHS managers. So it's on more of a traditional EHS structure. Right. I think we asked this one already. There might have, hopefully it didn't get messed up. There should be one more. Let's see if there's not, then trying to remember what it was, but I think this is the one that I was most interested in, which one gives you the most support, and is 14,001. So let's move on to the next one because we've already answered this question. All right, so that's good. Let's move on. And so this is the section of the presentation where we're going to be talking about how you fit your sustainability reporting and actions together with your ISO system. And so this is just overarching, these are the three things that we saw: the strategy, the governance, the risk, and the data and targets, right? That's what the frameworks are requiring you to report for sustainability. And then this is how the ISO systems and each clause fits within these four items, right? So your strategy fits very well with the context of your organization. I would be interested to see, what is your sustainability strategy? And then what do you say in clause 4 of the context of your organization? And it should be the same, if not very similar. Governance obviously fits in a lot of places within ISO. Risk planning, it's the same thing. You're in planning for your ISO systems, you're looking at risk and opportunities, right? If you've identified different risks for your sustainability strategy versus your ISO system, that might be something to look at. And then obviously clause 9 in your ISO standards looks at performance evaluation, and that gets right back to data that you're reporting in your sustainability reports. So this all looks good. It makes sense to me, but I wanted to dive a little deeper and really understand what's happening within organizations, and if this is really working together, if the ISO systems are really working to support your sustainability reporting and your sustainability goals. So one thing that I did is I pulled all of LRQA's findings globally for all the audits we do for 14,001 over the past 3 years. That was about 34,000 findings or nonconformances. So there's a lot of data to look at, a lot of different things going on there. But I found a couple things that I thought were interesting. One, 12%, you'll see that the pink square here, 12% of the findings related to clause 9.1, which is directly the monitoring and measurement of metrics and objectives. And that gets right up to the accuracy of data that's reported, right? So this is at a site level. The site is going through the audit. They have findings and they're addressing these findings. And their data is also being pulled to a corporate level for sustainability reporting. And so that's at a site level. If you're making your data more accurate, obviously it's making your sustainability reporting more accurate. And then on the left side, the green, 24% of these findings were related to clause 8.1 around operational planning and control. And there were various issues in that really, I mean, 8.1 can handle cover a lot of different things. But I found it interesting that about 10% of those 24 findings involved waste. And I know a lot of companies have goals around zero waste to landfills, or at least they're reporting their waste generation numbers in their sustainability reports. And that relies on sites correctly calculating their waste numbers. And during these audits, right, we're having a lot of findings around how waste is handled incorrectly or classified incorrectly. So if that's happening at a site level, how is the data at a corporate level correct? Or maybe to put it in another way, if you're going through these audits, you're finding these issues and correcting them, which then makes your corporate data more correct. And then more real. And this is just findings from third-party auditors, right? I'm sure these companies are also doing internal audits, and they're finding and correcting things during those internal audit processes that are also improving their processes and their data. So I thought that was very interesting to see. So I thought, well, okay, let's compare. This is just 14,001, which is obviously from the poll questions, right, the most common one. But I wanted to look at other standards as well. This is 50,001, which is energy management systems. This one is less popular, I would say, and less not used as frequently around the world as 14,001, but I still pulled 2 years worth of data and looked at the nonconformances. And I thought it was interesting for this one that 32% were involved around planning, which is the risk and opportunities. And the 22% was around the performance evaluation, which is getting back to the accuracy of the data. And energy, I mean, this is solely on energy, and many different organizations have goals around energy reduction. So obviously this process helps them improve that data. So going one step further than just looking at overall findings and where they fit into the clauses, I wanted to actually see what the findings were and what improvements were being made at the organizations. And so this table, don't look at it across because they're not related on the rows, but if you just look down on the columns, I pulled a couple findings from some of these standards to try to understand how this was working, right? So if we start at 14,001, environmental management systems, one of the findings I thought was interesting was environmental data, right, was incorrectly identified as health and safety data, which is kind of silly. How does that happen? Well, it happens, and this happened enough that it was brought up during a third-party audit. That's just meaning that at a corporate level, when you're trying to pull data from each site, the data that you're pulling, there was maybe some misunderstanding at the site level on where to report it, or some miscommunication on how to report it, and that gets up to the corporate level that the data they're trying to report is incorrect. And so hopefully that was corrected and it worked out, right? And the next finding I thought was interesting, basically talking about significant and widespread lack of due environmental care was observed. And this just gets back to your risks and opportunities. And if you're having sites that are going through these audits and realizing this, there's an opportunity there to help them correct it. And that will then help you meet your sustainability goals. The next one, waste bins were mixed with contaminated and non-contaminated waste. So that's a specific example of, if this site was to be reporting their waste generated data, have feeling it would have been not correct. Right, so now you're trying to make goals around your waste, And how can you when you're not getting the correct data from your sites? And hopefully now it's corrected, and so you can meet your goals more efficiently. So 50,001, similar findings. One, the first one is it could not be demonstrated that all energy performance indicators and energy baseline data had been normalized. This is really, we have a ton of data that we're all looking at every day, right? And we have targets that are backed by that data. And it is critical that we understand that that data is comparing apples to apples, because if it's not, we're not telling the correct story. And that's just important to understand that. The next one, processes for communicating that energy performance is one of the evaluation criteria for procurement, is not fully effective. So this one I thought was an interesting finding, because it gets to, at the beginning, right, who's talking to who and who's involved in sustainability. So this is, right, really to you have sustainability implemented at your organization. Procurement needs to be thinking about it, as well as the environmental staff, as well as the sustainability staff, as well as real estate, whoever, right? So procurement, whenever they're buying something, you, as an organization, you probably have a net zero goal, which means you need to reduce your energy performance. When your buyers are buying things for your company, they need to be thinking about that to help your organization meet your net zero goals. And that's, and this is identified during the audit that some communication needs to happen a little better. And then the last one really just gets to data accuracy. And how can you make claims when you're not collecting accurate data at the site level? So those are management system findings that you have when you have a certified management system. We also do verification, which is more focused not on a system, but it's focused on the accuracy and completeness of the data. So these findings I pulled just as examples of findings that we have during verification process. And most of them relate to accuracy of data. The first one talks about the quantity of fuel used, the quantity that they used to calculate emissions against was not consistent with the evidence that the site provided. And it was a pretty large difference. And so that's, if this site, I don't know if they did or not, if they had an ISO system, maybe that would have been corrected before the verification happened. Then the second one is about refrigerants and identifying different refrigerants. And that's important when it gets to your emissions calculations, because different refrigerants have different global warming potentials. And so they basically have different emissions. And so if, a site thinks they have R417A, but they really have R410A, depending on the different refrigerants, that can be actually a material difference. So it's, these findings we're having, it can be corrected if they had a system that was checking this internally. And the last one too is about accuracy of data. So yeah, that's hopefully what I see is, right, we have the sustainability goals at a corporate level, then all the way down to the site level, how ISO systems can help you correct the data. Right. So now that you have understood, right, the sustainability frameworks and what those are requiring, what ISO systems require, and then how they can be matched together, really, I want to leave you with a call to action, right? If you have certified systems within your company, make sure they're working together to the best way possible, with the same objectives, same focus. And if not, why aren't they, and solve that, right? Let's use the tools that we have to drive real progress. So I'll leave it at that. Why don't we open it now to questions and answers? I am excited to hear from you.
And I mentioned this in the attendee chat, but I just want to thank everyone who's on with us today for being so actively involved in today's discussion. I have so many questions to choose from for you, Heather. So let's get started. We will do our best to answer the 40 plus questions that have come in over the last 35 minutes. Okay, so let's get started. Is an ESG strategy really necessary for a company with fewer than 10 personnel and who buys virtually all, and someone who buys products overseas? How would you measure that?
Sure, that's a great question. I was just, and that I would say a resounding yes, right? I mean, is it critical for us to live on this planet? Yes. And we all use resources. If it's a company of 10 people, perhaps they have a less impact than a huge company, but you're still having an impact. You know, maybe it's a consulting firm. Maybe you have data stored on, what do they call it? Data, whatever. Data centers, that's it, right? You're using data centers. Data centers use a lot of energy and a lot of electricity and maybe a lot of water use as well for cooling or refrigerants. This is something that you need to understand what your footprint is and understand how you can reduce it. If you don't have a sustainability strategy, you won't be considering those implications. Also, I think one more thing to consider, no matter what the size of your business is, if you can show that you are looking at these topics, it makes your product or whatever you're delivering, what service you're delivering, much more interesting to your clients, right? And you may find that there's businesses that you haven't considered in the past, and now you have it, right? It's actually more money for you, more commercial opportunities for you that way. So there's two things, right? One, you want to make sure that you're being responsible, even in your small footprint. You know, you want to look at your supply chain where you're purchasing a lot of things overseas. Where is it coming from? What risks do you have in that supply chain? And then, more business opportunities for you as well.
All makes sense. And we're actually going to stay on the supply chain topic. What are the bottlenecks for ESG in supply chain management in terms of growth as well as technology?
That's a good question. So that's a whole nother topic, right? Supply chain bottlenecks. I'm not gonna talk about that now, but what I see, especially for sustainability, is scope 3. And if you know, so there's 3 scopes of emissions, and emissions are categorized in 3 scopes, I'll say, right? So there's scope 1, which is your direct emissions, scope 2, indirect emissions like electricity. Scope 3 is everything else, other indirects. It can be as simple as business travel or employee commuting, or it's purchased goods and services or use of sold products. And how, just looking at purchased goods and services, how do you calculate your scope 3 emissions for purchased goods and services for your supply chain? And a bottleneck there is just data, right? That needs a lot of data. And how are we going to share that? You know, how I want to know my tier 1 suppliers' emissions. We're starting there. We're starting to see suppliers reporting their emissions to companies. We're starting to see bigger companies requiring their suppliers to do that so that they can better calculate their scope 3 emissions. But we have a long way to go in the scope 3 future, I would say.
Thank you for mentioning and talking about scope 3. I know we're not really talking about supply chain management right now, but scope 3 was something that was brought up by attendees through the group chat today. So thank you for touching on that. All right, so let's get into this. Might be one of my favorite questions that has come in because I think it is relevant no matter what industry you are in. Which connections do you see between ISO requirements regarding context, interested parties, and ESG materiality requirements?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I should go back to the slide where we kind of, maybe I can do that. I think you can see this, right?
Yep.
It is, here, right? So this is how I see overall it fitting in. Now, if the question was specific to materiality analysis, what a materiality analysis is in these 4 things: strategy, governance, risk, and data. you need to figure out what's most important to your stakeholders for you to include. There's a lot of stuff you can include in those 4 categories, right? But what's most important? And that's where your materiality analysis comes in. And I would think if you have a certified system or you haven't, but maybe you can work on it, whatever you've identified in ISO system under planning would help inform your materiality to your risk. If you're in the process of doing a materiality analysis on a corporate level, look at what you've done already for your ISO systems, if you have that in place. Or you can just review the standards and see what the ISO standards recommend, and see if that helps inform your materiality analysis. I think it's quite connected, everything that you're covering here.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. And, being transparent, and we're going to ask you now for some advice. This question came in, and there's a couple people in the mechanical engineering industry, and they purchase and build motors. So you mentioned scope 3 earlier. So how is the scope 3 downstream determined for a mechanical engineering company? For example, should they calculate the emissions from the final product, or do you need to have data from each part of the process?
Sure. That depends on your scope. I would say it depends, right? It depends on what you're trying to do, what your scope is. I've looked at life cycle analysis. We verified, product emissions, and usually, if you look into the details of how product emissions are calculated, there'll be some identification of the scope. Sometimes it's just the use of the sold product, and that's where it's just the use phase. You're not looking at the full life cycle emissions. I know I've looked at life cycle emissions for oil and gas, for gasoline, let's say, and about 70% or so, maybe 60 to 70% of those emissions for the full life cycle of gasoline is based on when you burn it in your tank of your car, or when it's burned. So it's you spend a ton of time looking at the rest of the life cycle, and it's important to do that. There's various methods to estimate. There's various databases out there that have impact factors. There's assumptions that you can make. There's a lot of stuff, but all of that work, you have to determine how material it is to your goal and how much time it's going to take to come up with actual data versus estimated data, and how beneficial that will be for what you're trying to do. I don't know if I answered the question, but hopefully
I think you did.
A starting point. Yeah.
I think you gave the attendees who did ask questions about specific industries a starting point if they need one, or something that they can look into more. This question actually just came in. Do you see that ISO standards also help to meet the new directive on corporate sustainability reporting requirements and mandatory requirements?
I'd say yes. One example is for mandatory requirements. So there's a lot of, like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of regulatory drivers that are requiring companies to report on their climate risk and report their emissions. One example is in the EU, there's a regulation around requiring energy audits. At the moment, the name of the regulation is elusive. I can't remember it, but I can look it up. But basically, it's requiring companies to track their energy performance and go through energy audits. And instead of doing energy audits, another way to meet that regulation is to have an ISO 50001 certified system, right? So that's a direct example where having an ISO system meets the regulatory requirements. And quite frankly, it seems instead of going through an energy audit every year and working through that, just to have a system, it can be easier for your organization. So that's one example. I think overall, right, part of ISO systems, whether it's quality, environmental, or any, the other examples, in some of the clauses, you have to look at legal and other requirements, compliance risk, And if you, and it gives you a solid foundation to evaluate any compliance risk and compliance requirements that you might have. So indirectly, I think having an ISO system does help because it gives you a framework to analyze that that requirement.
Thank you. And I think, this was a topic that was brought up a couple of times in our Q&A widget, is the S in ESG. Is there an ISO system to measure S, the S component?
Sure. S, social, is that's a lot. There's a lot in social, right? There's social metrics that companies can report, right? There's a percentage of women in leadership or whatever it might be. It might be safety. A lot of people look at safety as a social metric. So yeah, I mean, for safety, there's 45,001, right? So that helps you manage your occupational health and safety. There's also, a lot of people think when they think social, you think labor audits, human rights audits, social audits. And that there is an ISO standard for that. It's 26,001, covering social responsibility. So there's that. There's also numerous other standards out there that help you manage it. I think that if you even just thinking about 14,001, which is focused on environmental, but it has aspects of training and competence. So maybe lightly touching on social as well. So, it's, yeah, I think, hopefully that answered. I can't think of anything else at the moment, but hopefully that answered the question.
No, I think that's great. And, I know it also depends on your specific ESG goals and targets and what you as your company is focusing on. So if we go back to emissions reporting related to scope 3, when, for example, emissions reporting is done more than once. So my company reports on emissions related to the use of the product, and the producer also does. So what is that going to look like? How is that going to play a role into the overall reporting structure?
Sure. So that's why we have scopes, right? So for you, it might be a scope 3, right? You said there was a producer. The producer is reporting their emissions as scope 1 or scope 2. It comes into your inventory as a scope 3 because it's maybe you're purchasing something from them. So that's the whole design of the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, to reduce double counting, but also to help you look at where your emissions are within your organization, how much influence you have over those emissions. Obviously, scope 3, you have less influence over them, but you have to engage your suppliers and work with them on those instead of just being able to directly influence how much consumption you have.
Makes complete sense. We're going to pivot a little bit and talk about management. So who is the standard management driver? And this had to do with one of the poll questions. But who is the standard management driver in the company for sustainability implementation? And I know that can look different depending on the industry, depending on the size of the company, dealing with boards or public companies. So if you could give just a kind of a brief overview in your experience, what you've seen and what any best practices you've picked up.
Sure, that's a great question. We have seen over the time, and I think that there's data out there to show this, but companies are starting to have directors of sustainability or sustainability managers or whatever that might be at a corporate level. I know within LRQA, we now have a sustainability director, right, who's managing our own sustainability efforts, which is excellent. But we didn't have that 10 years ago, so now I would say mostly it's that corporate role that companies are starting to hire in an individual or a team to manage sustainability efforts throughout the company. But they are dependent on all of the aspects. They're dependent on procurement doing their work, right? They're dependent, of course, on the environmental folks and the EHS to do their work. But they're really looking, they're the drivers, but they're reliant on the full organization to really be on board. And that is helpful mostly for the executive leadership team to be visibly supporting what the sustainability director is doing, right? You can't just have one person trying to push this. Everyone within your organization has to be involved.
No, I mean, and I think that's, a theme with many organizations that in the past was not appreciated or implemented is the collaborative culture, the transparency from upper management, and really getting, feedback from employees as well as having their input in different strategies. So you have a sustainability, or you have a manager now. How often does this person meet with various members of the team? Do you have one big corporate meeting, or is it just really depends on what the topic is that he or she would like to discuss?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say one of the most important jobs of the sustainability director is to be in touch with your whole organization. You need to understand what's going on, what's happening. And that depends on the complexity of your organization, right? And what's the reach, what's the geographies, what's reasonable for you to be in touch. But you need to understand, if you don't know what's going on, then how are you managing it? I know for LRQA, we've had, we're developing our strategy, and in that development, they had weekly sessions and monthly sessions for different audiences, and it depended, right? It depended, but once we're done with that process, and they try to get input from everyone in the organization, or at least all parts of the organization, then it goes from there, and then you move to the next set of communications once you have that set. Now, how are you going to maintain it and manage it? One thing I was going to also add is, I guess this gets back to the other question, but what we see is right, you have the corporate director. You also have your executive team, who now has remuneration benefits. They have goals that they have to meet, and those goals might be reduction in carbon emissions or something directly around their sustainability efforts. And they have goals around that they have to meet for their bonuses. And that makes it so much more, I guess everyone talks money, right? So that makes it more important for them and for the whole organization. And I think it trickles down. Right now I'm seeing other KPIs as part of your annual reviews. Your other roles within the organization have KPIs that are directed at their sustainability targets, which is just driving the improvement.
Now, and I know the EU is ahead of the United States in this, and tying employee compensation to ESG goals and hitting certain metrics. So, I talked to the CEO and founder of Amoresco earlier in this month, and you're reiterating a lot of what he said when we had our discussion. And so it's really nice to see, different industries and different companies having the same goals and aligning themselves, with sustainability and ESG. Now, this question came in through the chat. It has to do with, greenwashing. How can you prevent that? And, obviously the third-party verification systems that's one way. But besides that, is there, a way for companies to really ensure that the data that they're getting from their suppliers, for example, is accurate?
That's a great question. And I would say through auditing, right, it is interviewing the suppliers. So if you're focused on, there's different ways to do it depending on where the data comes from, right? If you're focused on data from suppliers, you yourself do your own sense checks of it. Look at other suppliers who are similar, and is it the same as or within the same ballpark as what you're seeing from other suppliers? Why is this much different? Look at outliers. Question the data, right? You're not just don't look at it and take it as truth. You have to question it. And what are the questions you're going to ask about it? How did it come up? What QA QC efforts does a supplier have on the data before they send it to you? And then if it's your own data, how are you defining it? How are you training the people who are generating the data to generate it correctly? Are they all talking the same language, literally and figuratively, actually? And how are you maintaining that common language and common source of data within your organization? I mean, this is, I think that organizations who are very careful about what they say, it really gets down to the people who are involved and how focused you are on, looking at the data, looking at what you're saying and making sure that it's correct. I mean, all of my years experience in auditing, I haven't met anyone who's intentionally said something that's wrong, or lied about something. I really haven't. It's mostly out of ignorance. And so how do you educate yourself to understand where the risks and opportunities are, right? That's risks and that's planning. Yeah. So that gets you right back to your ISO standard there.
Yeah. I mean, understanding, where ignorance or, just realizing that some data might have been, as you talked about earlier, inputted, put in incorrectly, just because the person doing it wasn't, educated enough to know exactly how they should put the data in or where it would go. So just providing that professional development for employees that are going to be looking at the data, analyzing the data before it goes into verification. This question, and then I know we're running out of time. I feel like we could have a full Q&A for hours on on this topic. From our friends in the EU, can you talk a little bit about CSRD?
Sure. I can tell you what I know. We have experts within LRQA who are located in Europe who know the details, the technical details a lot more than I do. But yeah, it's a regulation that's requiring companies to report their climate risk as part of the financial disclosures, kind of. And as part of reporting climate risk, there's some discussions and governance and strategies that they're going to need to report, but it's also going to require verification of their greenhouse gas emissions. And yeah, it starts with limited assurance, and I think it's going to move on to reasonable at a later date. And I know sometimes with the CSRD and with other regulations within the EU around climate risk and all of these, it depends on each member state. And so there may be different requirements based on the member state. So it gets kind of confusing, but overall, it's requiring companies to report their climate risk and their greenhouse gas emissions and get those emissions verified by a third party.
Got it. And that makes complete sense. We are almost at the top of the hour right now. I do want to thank the team at LRQA as well as Heather for providing us such invaluable information this morning, this afternoon, this evening. We have people from all over the world joining us today. So I do want to thank that. I'm going to give Heather the last word, but I just want to remind attendees that if you have questions for Heather or any member of LRQA, please feel free to submit in the chat widget now, or you can submit it in the survey. The survey is going to pop up on your screen at the conclusion of the event, but it is also available at the bottom if you want to fill it out now. We appreciate all the feedback that you have for us at E&E Leader as well as LRQA. So Heather, I'm going to give you the floor to kind of wrap it up, and then I'll close out today's event.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate the time. We have a big task ahead of us. The whole world has a big task ahead of us, and there are so many conflicting and moving parts to what we're trying to do. But let's just start with using the tools that we have, right? And that's the whole point of this talk, was look at what we have within ISO. ISO management system standards help. Let's use that to help drive real progress.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We have the tools, and we need to work together. And this is a global initiative, global problems that we are dealing with in terms of sustainability and net zero emissions. So again, thank you everyone for being on with us. The event will be available on demand for those who watched today's presentation live, as well as those, and I apologize as we are closing up for the dog of mine that's whining in the background. We may almost almost made it through the entire hour without any noise. And a certificate of attendance is available to all registrants who hit the attendance requirements. So that will be available in your console, as well as the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow. So thank you again. And at this point, we're going to conclude the webinar. And Heather, I look forward to working with you more in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Okay.